Hi everybody and welcome to today's event. Thank you for joining. My name is Juliet Tunstall. I'm the External Events Officer here at the International Institute for Environment and Development. Really delighted to be here with you all today and really looking forward to today's discussion on COVID-19, debt relief and the climate and biodiversity crisis, which will start in a few moments. I can see a few of you are joining us now, the numbers going up. So today's event is part of the IIED Debates webinar series, which aims to create a space for conversation and debate on key and current sustainable development issues. If you're interested in signing up for regular updates on the events, we have a newsletter and I will share the link towards the end of the session. I think that's it from me now. With that, I'll hand over to Andrew Norton, IIED Director, who is going to be moderating our panel today, introducing the topic and the speakers. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Juliet. Many thanks for all your work setting this up. So today's event will explore how we can tackle the triple crises of debt, climate change and biodiversity loss using debt for climate and nature swaps. We're introducing a recently released IIED report tackling the triple crisis using debt swaps to address debt, climate and nature loss post-COVID-19. Paul Steele, one of the authors of that report, will present the work. And I should also acknowledge Sonja Patel from IIED, who's the co-author. So even before the pandemic hit, fears were growing over developing country debt, which had surpassed $8 trillion by the end of 2019. And the pandemic has made the situation worse in many ways. The economic impacts of the crisis are pushing millions more women, children and men in lower and middle income countries into poverty. There are also, of course, the health impacts that are extremely difficult, challenging for those countries to deal with. And the countries are also facing macro problems, hits to exports and tax revenues. All in all, we can expect to see debt in low-income countries rise pretty rapidly, and it's doing so from a basis that was already highly problematic and unsustainable, and indeed impinging on the capacity of lower and middle-income countries to deliver basic services to their populations. So, as part of pandemic economic rescue packages, we're exploring the proposition that governments have an opportunity to address simultaneously the crises of debt, climate and biodiversity loss through the use of a new system of debt for climate and nature program swaps for the benefit of lender and debtor governments as well as private creditors. So the basic idea is that we can use these to support a recovery that builds forward to more sustainable future with better outcomes in terms of both the climate crisis and the global crisis of biodiversity loss. So to discuss this today, I'm delighted to welcome our excellent panel of speakers. Paul Steele will present this work first, and then we have two excellent discussants, Sonja Gibbs and Dr Shamshad Akhtar. So Paul, I'll introduce the speakers now. Paul Steele is Chief Economist in IIED's Shaping Sustainable Markets Research Group and an author of the report Tackling the Triple Crisis. He specialises on the linkages between environment, climate and poverty reduction, and Paul has more than 20 years experience with international organisations including UNDP, the European Union, the World Bank and IUCN, as well as UK and Sri Lankan governments. Sonja Gibbs is the Managing Director and Head of Sustainable Finance at the Institute of International Finance. Her work covers global debt and sovereign debt policy issues, financial stability risks, sustainable finance and capital markets, development in emerging and frontier markets. Sonja leads IIF's policy work on sustainable finance and infrastructure investment, including liaison efforts vis-à-vis the G20, the multilaterals and the international regulatory community. And last but not least, Dr Shamshad Akhtar served as Governor of the State Bank of Pakistan and Finance Minister in the last caretaker government. She has worked for several multilateral institutions, including the United Nations, where she served as the Under Secretary General of the Economic and Social Commission of the Asia and Pacific, UNESCAP, and Senior Special Advisor on Economics and Finance of the UN Secretary General, and concurrently served for 5 years as UN G20 Sherpa for Development and Finance Tracks. So it's an excellent panel, really looking forward to the discussion, and I will start now by handing over to Paul for a short presentation on using debt swaps to address debt, climate and nature loss post-COVID-19.
Great, well thanks very much Andy. So I'm going to, as Andy indicated, present the report that I co-authored with my colleague Sejal Patel from IIED. So this is the title of the report, which I think you've all received already, the link from Juliet in the Eventbrite instructions. But this will be a short presentation to illustrate the report for those of you who've not had time to go through it. So it's, as Andy indicated, tackling the triple crisis and of using debt swaps to address debt, climate and nature in a post-COVID-19 world. So the three crises. First of all, there's a debt crisis. As you see from the graph, there's both rising public and private debt for the last few decades. The blue colouring indicates that private debt has been going up slightly more than the orange public debt, but both have been rising quite rapidly. The second and third crisis are the climate crisis. You see here a picture of a flooded house from, I think, in Kenya. And then in terms of the nature or biodiversity crisis, there's an example of deforestation with a photo taken of logs being cut down in Mozambique. So that's the triple crisis. So what are these debt for climate and nature program swaps, which we're proposing in this paper? Debt for climate and nature program swaps are where a creditor allows the debt to be reduced in one of three possible forms. First of all, conversion to a local currency. Secondly, possibly paid back at a lower interest rate. Or thirdly, some form of debt write-off. So all of these approaches would in some way reduce the debt. And then the answer is, how can this money be used? The money can be saved in terms of poverty reducing and growth enhancing climate resilience. For example, planting climate resilient crops, climate emissions mitigation, for example, investing in renewable energy, or biodiversity protection, such as investing in reducing human-wildlife conflict, which plagues many protected areas. So these are the three ways that the debt reduction could be used in terms of the swap. So how do we get these debts large scale? And this is what we set out is necessary in terms of the post-COVID challenge, when the debt was already significant, but is now really become very large. So far, nature or climate swaps have been focused on smaller projects where the money is managed in trust funds by international non-governmental organizations. We propose instead that these swaps should shift from smaller projects to larger programs through the use of what we call budget support. And this is where funds are paid into a debtor government's own budget. This has three main advantages. First of all, budget support allows for larger amount of funds to be swapped. And as I indicated, that's vital given the circumstances of the post-COVID debt crisis. Secondly, budget support increases debtor government ownership. So that instead of the links of the swap being to an international NGO, it's through a government's own budget. And thirdly, a budget support approach allows accountability to national citizens through the budget. So instead of, again, being accountable to an international NGO, the budget process allows the normal budgetary system to be linked to national citizens. This approach is already being used by small island developing states, or SIDS, and least developed countries. To give two examples, in the Caribbean, the small island development states have a climate and nature swap proposal, which they tabled at the recent UN Secretary General's Climate Summit. And secondly, the Least Developed Country Initiative for Effective Adaptation and Resilience, or LIFE-AR, has a similar approach where local government systems are used. In the paper, we set out what are the priority countries for climate and nature program swaps. These we identify by ranking countries according to 4 criteria, as indicated in the slide. First of all, according to debt distress, how much debt are they facing? Secondly, according to climate vulnerability. Thirdly, according to biodiversity richness, how much valuable biodiversity do they have and to what extent it's being lost and threatened. And fourthly, how creditworthy are they? So how well will the money be used if they were given debt relief? And you see from the table the different priority of countries. So the highest priority for this kind of approach is Cape Verde and Vietnam. Second priority are the countries of Honduras, Kenya, Nicaragua, and Papua New Guinea. And the third priority are Cambodia, Kyrgyz Republic, Madagascar, Mozambique, Senegal, Sri Lanka, Uganda, and Vanuatu. So all of these countries are high priority. They all have debt distress. They're all climate vulnerable. They all are rich in biodiversity, and they all have quite strong credit worthiness. What are the benefits of climate and nature program debt swaps? And I've identified the benefits against various different stakeholders. So first of all, for ministries of finance and central banks in debtor governments, and hopefully we'll hear more about this from Shamshad when she talks about the example of her country, Pakistan, there are hopefully these debt swaps will lead to increased growth by reinvesting in climate resilience, which is needed to increase growth in many of these vulnerable countries. There's also increased ownership of debt swaps, as I've already indicated. In terms of climate negotiators who attend the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, this approach will identify new sources of climate finance that will dwarf the Green Climate Fund. So while there's a lot of attention on the Green Climate Fund, the potential of a Climate for Nature global swap initiative would dwarf the money in the Green Climate Fund. Thirdly, in terms of China, which is the largest holder of bilateral debt, they are hosting next year the UN Biodiversity Convention. And one of the aims of that convention is to finance biodiversity. So by initiating or being involved in initiating such a debt for nature and climate scheme, they could contribute to the aims of the Biodiversity Convention. Fourthly, in terms of private creditors, and here we'll hopefully be hearing more from Sonja, from her organization, which represents many private creditors, there are a number of advantages. First of all, increased debt sustainability, so they won't have to hopefully provide more debt to countries in the future. Many of these large global asset managers have themselves climate commitments, such as commitments to reduce emissions of greenhouse gases. And also there's a possible scheme we propose in the paper that if the EU was involved in such an approach, they could use existing emission credits from the EU credit scheme to pay off creditors. In terms of the next stakeholder, the Paris Club, that's the OECD countries who are creditors, they could have a new source of finance for climate, which many of them have already committed to, but is being challenged in the austerity that will be faced post-COVID. And finally, I just wanted to identify the UK, which is host of next year's UN Climate Change Convention, COP, will also have a new source of climate finance, which they could champion in terms of this approach. So here we come to the final slide. with a forward look. We propose in the paper, and a number of other groups are working alongside us to call for similar things, for an international initiative on climate and debt program swaps. So we call on the international community to work with debtor governments to establish a technical working group under the guidance of an international body such as the World Bank to develop a comprehensive and coordinated climate and nature program swap initiative over the next 3 years to address the triple crisis of debt, climate and biodiversity loss. And it's hopefully an opportune time for this kind of process to take off, with the World Bank and IMF annual meetings coming up next month. So this kind of technical working group could get going there. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much indeed, Paul. Can I just ask you quickly before moving to the online poll, the next element? You indicate that the majority of experience in terms of debt for nature and climate swaps has been project-based rather than program-based. Would that be true?
Correct, yeah.
Yeah. Just quickly, what are the key advantages of the program approach?
Well, as I set out in the presentation, it can allow the swaps to be larger scale. It can allow them to have greater government ownership and greater accountability to national citizens.
Great. Thanks very much, Paul. Okay, we've now got a quick online poll, which the question in it, Juliet will be putting this up, is: do you think debt for climate and nature program swaps are a useful approach? And yes, no, possibly are the options for response. Right, so yeah, mixed responses, very, very few no's though. So that's generally a very positive response. 58% yes, and 39% possibly. So it's great to see that there's basically an appetite for exploring this approach among today's participants. And now we're going to dig a little more into some of the opportunities that this approach, debt for climate and nature swaps, presents, as well as explore some of the challenges. So now, if I could go to our first discussant, Shamshad Akhtar. Shamshad, general responses, please, to the concepts that Paul has outlined and the approach that he's outlined. But it would also be great to hear from you what you think the government perspective on this, in terms of the opportunities and challenges in indebted developing countries, is likely to be. Shamshad, please go ahead.
Thanks for presenting the findings of the report. The beauty is in the simplicity that has been offered. I think we have to recognize that we are in a heterogeneous world. So no one solution will fit all is something that I do feel. Country ownership has to be a fundamental element, but for debt swaps to work, we have to go with a big bang. We need a global deal. We need common understanding of its objectives, and we need a proper architecture for it. We have to respect sovereignty of the debtors and value of creditors' obligations. We have to recognize that key priorities that countries face may be different from the others that are being floated. Lastly, let me mention that right now, since we haven't gotten out of COVID, it's still unfolding, and there is a huge degree of uncertainty as to where we'll end up. Countries are still in a rescue mode. And I can tell you from my country standpoint that the highest degree of attention is being paid to still firefight, to ensure that the businesses are restarting effectively, people are getting relief. So any funding that is coming forward, be it through the IMF, the World Bank, quick dispersing operations, it is all being devoted essentially for the, by and large, non-development expenditure with social safety nets, revival of businesses. So as yet, there hasn't been much thinking on the debt swap, but I do think this is a very good instrument, and it is very much wanted, given that we have to go to the next stage of building back better, and it has a potential to do so.
Thank you very much indeed. That was, for anyone who missed the introduction, that was Dr. Shamshad Akhtar, formerly Minister of Finance and Governor of the Central Bank in Pakistan, and many other things as well. Many thanks for those perspectives, and particularly for reminding us that this remains a crisis situation, that we're not in any sense coming out of the other end of this. So this sense of what's the segue between when countries essentially need relief assistance and when that moves to building forward to a better reality, if you like, and the green recovery questions is a really key element. So thank you very much indeed, Shamshad. I'd now like to move to our next discussant, Sonja Gibbs from the IIF. Sonja, it would be great to hear a bit from you about the opportunities of this approach from a private sector perspective, and perhaps reflection on the challenges, but also any just broad observations on the material that we're discussing today. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and our thanks to the IIED for including us in this very timely event. Just to say a note about the Institute of International Finance, we represent a wide variety of creditors in international debt markets, and that's something that Paul highlighted that I think is very important. The creditor base for these countries is so different now. So not just on the commercial side, not just banks, but also institutional investors, bondholders, pension funds, sovereign wealth funds. So you have three distinct buckets of creditors: commercial, multilaterals, and official bilateral. And that's important to remember when you're thinking about the design of solutions like debt for nature swaps. I wanted to add a little perspective here on our work in channeling private sector support for the G20 Debt Service Suspension Initiative. And I suspect most listeners will be familiar with this, but it calls for a short-term suspension of debt payments for the world's poorest and most vulnerable countries. And both official and private creditors asked to participate on comparable terms. So the latest data from the G20 shows that 42 countries have applied for debt service relief, allowing them to delay a total of about 5.3 billion in repayments due this year, and that's about half of the total that's owed to official bilateral creditors. Countries have by and large not asked private creditors for relief, and this is largely due to concerns about market access, and I'll get to that in a minute. Many would argue, many have, that this is by no means enough. So World Bank President David Malpass has noted that the risk of relapse to debt distress is very high, and that a more systemic approach to debt relief could include reduction in the stock of debt. And I think we're going to be hearing quite a lot about considerations like this, reducing the actual stock of debt that's been built up, which is where solutions like debt for nature swaps can play an important role. But the bottom line, and something I want to emphasize, is that the debt problems we're facing can't be dealt with by public or private sector alone. So debt for nature swaps are a great example of the kind of collaboration on the toolkit for addressing these urgent problems. Just returning to this market access question, and also to the kind of borrower perspectives that I think are often lost in some of these discussions. Unless we're taking the view that low income and developing countries should only have access to concessional finance, private finance is absolutely needed to maintain liquidity and avoid future solvency problems. So our discussions with borrowing countries suggest that many concur with this view, believing that development finance can't be met fully just by official creditors and donors. So whatever solutions we look toward, they need to preserve countries' ability to access market finance. You know, we have a lot of discussions. We have an investor group representing over 100 of the largest global investors, something like 45 trillion in assets under management. And so our goal has been trying to build consensus around ways the private sector can help. And I just wanted to share some of the things we've been thinking about in our discussions. And first of all, this COVID crisis is probably the first where sustainable finance and responsible investment tools and mechanisms can make a real difference. And this is particularly true against the backdrop of rapidly growing investor demand for ESG assets, and that's very well documented. So it's kind of bringing these two things together in an interesting nexus, debt and sustainability. So we've been thinking about the use of innovative sustainable finance instruments to help in the specific context of emerging market sovereign debt crises. So to sum up, I'll just share a few ideas from these discussions, and these have included SDG bond funds, guarantees, and swaps. So, for example, SDG aligned bond funds, as Paul had mentioned earlier, can be significantly scaled up, building on the experience of the Planet Emerging Green 1 bond fund developed with the IFC. So another example of where you have multilateral and private sector collaboration. This could really be expanded to funds investing in emerging market SDG-linked debt. So that's an area, a niche of the asset class that has potential for tremendous expansion. So as this is structured, you could have, for example, a first loss absorbing junior tranche of equity leveraging an IFI balance sheet, giving credit uplift, and that would attract not only existing investors in this type of debt, but new investors, so tapping into a new part of the creditor base. And you know, this first loss equity tranche could be substantially leveraged, as much as sort of 5 to 1 on some estimates. Another example is partially guaranteed SDG bonds. You could have new issuance that replaced existing emerging market sovereign issuance designed to avoid economic loss for investors holding the debt. And they could have a strong SDG component. So that could enable a partial G20 or official guarantee without principal or interest repayments for the first year. And importantly, you know, and getting back to the question of liquidity, right? I mean, when you have a relatively small market, we calculate that the universe of SDG linked debt, so that's green bonds, green loans, SDG linked bonds, and so on, is only about 1.5 trillion in total, which is a tiny fraction of the total global bond universe, which is over 110 trillion. So SDG bonds with partial guarantees could be eligible for index inclusion. And that's really important in attracting more investor demand. And finally, another thing that we've discussed in our investor groups is debt for sustainability swaps. And that's a kind of a, you know, debt for nature swaps are a subset of these, clearly. And these can help connect sovereign restructuring or even sort of debt suspension to commitments to invest in environmental goals. And so the idea here is to scale up and broaden to service the whole SDG range. So when you enter a debt restructuring, when a country goes into debt restructuring, they can engage directly with their private creditors that want to support this transition. And an increasing number of investors do see this as within their mandate. So not just a question of sort of immediate quarterly short-term returns, but having more of a mandate to focus on longer-term sustainability goals. So just linking it to the G20 debt service suspension initiative, this temporary moratorium in debt service payments could free up fiscal space, which could then be committed to invest in a country's sustainable development goals. So, and I think there was an interesting paper out from the LSE that did some calculations in the case of Argentina. If you took 200 billion in bonds with a 7.5% coupon and swapped that out for 6%, you could free up, you know, an additional 3 billion a year in additional cash flow. And that could be kind of set aside for SDG investments. So just to finish up here, there are a few considerations when we think about these instruments. To make this concept work and scale it up across emerging and developing economies, you've got to have good disclosure and reporting and accountability. Ownership and accountability, as was just mentioned, is critical from the emerging and developing economies themselves. Leadership from the IFIs, and above all, you need to generate that demand from private investors. And commitments are growing by the day. So these debt for nature swaps have tremendous potential. I'll stop there. Thanks.
It's really, really helpful, Sonja. Thanks. On this question of market access, is this predominantly around the ratings agencies, Moody's and so on? Is that what drives that concern that if debt is written off, that it might somehow affect a country's rating and therefore their access to capital?
I think that's an important part of it because it's how private markets work. In order to scale, you need standardization. To have standardization, you need consistent ratings. Ratings have a process. Ratings C, particularly in the case of Moody's, they've ascertained that debt service suspension is a potential economic loss, and therefore it affects the rating. It's not an easy thing to get around because it's part and parcel of the functioning of markets.
Great. Thanks very much. Paul, do you have any quick reactions to Sonja or Shakhtar's comments? Anything that you want to pick up quickly before we go out to the audience for Q&A?
Well, just from Shamshad, I would agree with her that the focus now is on the immediate recovery. So these things need to follow up on that. Well, obviously, countries are focusing on the short term now, but hopefully they're moving to the medium term at the same time. And then from what Sonja was saying, she was talking very much about SDG approaches. So SDGs obviously are broad, and sustainability are a broad term. I mean, we were zeroing in on the nature and climate dimension of that. So, but I think much of what she says is relevant to the specific focus of nature and climate.
Okay, that was great. I mean, many thanks to all three of you. Those were really, really excellent contributions. So I'm now going to move to the Q&A, and we've got a rating system for our questions. So I'm going to use that initially to prioritize. So the first question is from Mark Burnett. What is your sense of the appetite from countries that hold debt for the program swap concept? I'd like to go to all three of you on that, but Paul, do you want to start?
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously a key question. I mean, you need to look at both the creditors and the debtors, but you don't want this to be a top-down thing pushed by the creditors. We need demand from the debtor governments as well. And as Shamshad said, there are issues of sovereignty at stake. I mean, I think there are countries who would be keen on this approach. We've had some interesting discussions with the UNDP, who were going out to their member countries to see who in the membership is interested in taking up such an approach. As I mentioned, I think some of the small island developing states have already had a proposal which was presented at the UN Secretary General's summit at the end of last year to do such an climate swaps. So I think the appetite is there, particularly, as I say, amongst the small island developing states, which have a lot of debt and are particularly climate vulnerable. But as we've also identified in our priority list, there are some countries which may not be immediately obvious, such as Vietnam, which has quite a lot of debt, particularly to China, which may, or Sri Lanka for that matter, which also is quite indebted to China, which might also want to experiment with such an approach. Thanks.
Thanks, Paul. Shamshad, what would be your sense of the appetite from countries holding debt for the program swap concept?
I think the appetite will be first a function, right. The appetite will be first a function of how the debt stock relief evolves. Of course, we have G20's first reaction to it, the debt service standstill. That, as we know, is only until December. It is the repayments after a few years, and there is a grace period. But that doesn't take care, it doesn't create the needed fiscal space as yet to venture out to experimenting with different. So that's one element of the appetite. But also, as was pointed out, there is a private and a public sector mix. And with the private sector position being that we'd like to be in a voluntary mode, I'm not sure countries are going to be having that great an appetite, because they are looking for more certain solutions to the debt problem. And the debt surge is at different level, depending on small island economies, yes, but the low-income countries and middle-income countries that have huge outstandings and unsustainable debt in different, and are facing very difficult. So that environment and complexity has to be kept in mind. It remains to be established what balance between debt relief and debt for climate swap will be appropriate in different heterogeneous situations. Obviously, what would be helpful, and there has been a lot of discussion on the UN Financing for Development platform, is how do you really plan out an adequate debt relief for these different countries given the magnitude. I personally think an outright cancellation combined with, of course, an IMF World Bank framework, which has a policy component as well as a management component with very much defined elements for it, would be very helpful. Now, it is important to recognize that what we really need is sustainable emphasis on sustainable recovery and green recovery. So as we design the swaps, we have to recognize that we would have to put in elements. I mean, of course, it's great to have biodiversity and different elements of climate, but of immediate need is sustainable development, compliance with sustainable development goals, building back better. So it's these elements which need to be packaged with a debt swap, not just, you know, and of course it will vary. Some countries will go for debt for nature swap, others would go for more focused recovery and green recovery and sustainable recovery basis, which is rich in job generation, because that's what matters today is job generation, so that the debt sustainability is also assured. If you have assured sustainable growth, you have jobs there, then. So my own feeling is that countries will stumble. They will do specific preferred choice debt swaps. But what would be preferable is if we came out with a proper framework which has a policy elements, IMF conditionalities, if one uses that word, although I would hate to use that word because nobody wants to listen to a conditionality in such a crisis mode. But what I really meant is that if you direct the countries in the right direction for promoting, for rejuvenating growth, which will help bring down the debt GDP ratios.
Thank you very much, Shamshad. Sonja, I think you spoke to that quite a bit in your comments, in fact, to that area. So I'm going to move to another question for you. Do you think that giving ownership in national budgets for the swaps may put off creditors, including obviously private sector creditors that you've spoken about a fair bit, who may fear, whether justifiably or not, possible defaults or financial difficulties in the future for such governments? So hang on a minute, I've just lost that as it moved. This is one of the hazards of using this thing, is that the questions move up and down. But anyway, I think you got the basic point there, Sonja.
So it's a difficult question. I think, you know, the phrase accountability and conditionality are very important. And Shamshad mentioned the IMF framework in this context and IMF conditionality. And this is clearly very important when considering particularly longer term arrangements of the type that we're talking about with debt for nature swaps. So I think there is certainly going to be an element of, anytime you get something that's relatively novel or that hasn't been done at scale, you're going to get concerns around the terms and conditions on which it's executed. That being said, I mean, one thing that this DSSI experience has clearly demonstrated is that private creditors believe that borrowers need to be engaged, involved, and accountable themselves, right? Because we all know of the debt problems, we all know of the ways in which they can be resolved and the need for resolution, but how it's done is important, and borrower voices shouldn't be lost in this equation.
Thank you very much. That question was from Matt Collis. Shamshad, do you have anything that, any thoughts on that, whether difficulties could arise because creditors may fear that money may be repurposed in later budgets away from the original purpose of the debt swap?
Yeah, well, it's highly likely that it would be, particularly in a program budgeting context, having worked on these budgets in different countries. I would much rather choose between project program approach versus what I would call a more defined framework, however we tailor it. And in that context, I would much rather prefer that when we are talking about an institutional framework to coordinate, given that it takes so long to do these things, and given that you want to give the countries the choice to pick and choose, that it would be better if the international community agreed on a climate or whatever preference we have of the objective or the focus of this. I mean, we could have a climate investment trust fund placed at the World Bank, and it has predefined conditions, uses, and then any country that wishes to tap goes with this debt settlement and draws on that. The other is to actually look at a recovery fund where you could have a resilience and recovery fund. Again, you define it and you give option to the country to come and tap, because you won't know, time is too short, limited, and you can't have, it takes a long time. It takes 2-3 years to prepare a climate debt swap or a debt nature swap. You look at the past historical experience that to prepare the projects, it takes time. To coordinate countries, it takes time. So give it to the countries. You just set up the funding mechanism, institutional mechanism. These are my own personal views. I speak in my personal capacity. So I personally think that if you gave the choice, you gave a window, and you define, so that, as Sonia was saying, monitoring, accountability, oversight by the umbrella of the creditors, if need be, whatever we want to safeguard the interest of the creditors, interest of different stakeholders, define what it should be put to use, but give them a choice to pick and choose the windows that they need to. Because I have to tell you, money is fungible. You allocate money, being a budget fiscal person, you turn around and the money will go somewhere else. So it's better you have a defined thing, and then you have a monitoring and accountability mechanism.
Thank you very much, Shamshad. Paul, there's a related question I'd like to put to you before going to the final one. This is from Stephanie Griffiths-Jones. I'm sure many of you know. Paul, budget support mechanisms are great, but will the creditors be willing to do this without requiring conditionality? If you involve the World Bank, for example, they will certainly expect to put some conditions. So what's your initial thought on that?
Yeah, it's a very good question. We explicitly refer in the paper to the experience of the World Bank in terms of their development policy lending, what is known as DPLs within the bank, where the bank works out a set of criteria or results by which they provide lending to a country. And in fact, a lot of the environment programming of the bank has been using these environmental development policy lending, where you agree environmental results and then lend money against that. So I think by using such a results-based approach, where you make payments after countries adhere to certain criteria, you can hopefully reach a compromise between where Sonja's coming from on the creditor side and where Shamshad's coming from on the government side, in terms of everyone seeing some accountability and transparency.
Thanks very much, Paul. I'm going to move to the final question now because we're running short on time. This is from Alfonso. And it's about the role of local communities. Is there any role for the grassroots to play? Can they become policy actors within this process, within programs, program approaches that are in theory set up for citizen accountability? What is the space for bottom-up accountability, if you like? And is there any way in which this could be made material and tangible for people in terms of perceiving that there is any direct impact on their lives? I'll go around all three of you on that one. I know it's not an easy question, but Sonja, would you like to have the first go at that?
So I think I'll address this from the point of view of the investor community. And I will say, without aging myself too much, I've been around the block, gosh, must be 30, 35 years now. And I think this moment in history is kind of unique in that regard. If you look back, for example, to the Business Roundtable here in the US, their statement last year about the need to shift from kind of shareholder capitalism to stakeholder capitalism, that was truly remarkable. And I think we're seeing the repercussions of that kind of thinking throughout the investor community. So if there were ever a time when sort of grassroots movements, indigenous peoples, you know, the needs of the broader stakeholder community are being taken into consideration as part of investment mandates, you know, now is that time.
Thank you very much indeed, Sonja. Paul, do you want to go next on that, how local communities and bottom-up action fit within program swaps for debt swaps for nature and climate?
Yeah, great question. And maybe something, to be honest, we could have addressed more in the paper, but we can do that in future publications. I mean, basically, what the main way to do it is to make sure that the climate and biodiversity investments are pro-poor, so that they actually benefit women, children, and men who are living in poverty. So just to give some concrete examples in terms of climate change, looking at making households more resistant to floods, looking at saline crops, looking at post-disaster recovery after cyclones and floods and slow onset climate-related disasters. In terms of biodiversity, looking at ways to make sure that forestry investments involve indigenous and local communities, looking at ways that watershed management can involve local people. So all those ways are ways that when you put in place the kind of conditions that I alluded to, the criteria and results, you make sure that those are pro-poor and benefit local communities.
Thank you very much, Paul. Shamshad, any thoughts on grassroots involvement in this?
I think it is essential to have grassroots involvement. Local governments have to be involved and people have to be involved. But the reality is that the government's external debt is in a number of countries a responsibility of the federal government. And servicing and settlement of the liabilities also is that of the federal governments. Now, a lot of federal governments have allowed the flexibility to the state governments to go ahead and borrow, but they need clearances for everything. And there are terms and conditions for that. Now, in this situation, we are talking about using this space that is being created from the suspension or for that matter buyback or cancellation to then result in local currency resource generation. And in that context, it would be helpful if there was a systematic process to actually engage in the areas of biodiversity, nature, and all that, so that the local currency that is generated is deployed, which is much more flexible. There is more flexibility in that rather than the direct foreign exchange settlement issue. So that's one point. The second point is that you really need to develop the capabilities and develop the projects at a fast pace. And I do think that the concerned platforms should have project feasibility facilities to allow for quick development of projects that could be just ready because, as I said, it takes 1 or 2 years for all these things to be realized. The last point is with what we are being hit just now, the revenue, in our case rupee, but local currency revenue generation from the tax resources is at its low ebb. And you ultimately also need local currency for these kind of transactions. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. We'll go now for a second poll, which Juliet will put up. And while we're getting the answers in on that, I will ask each of our speakers for a final contribution. So this poll is what actors do you think should take the lead in coordinating a debt for climate and nature swap initiative? You can tag more than one. You don't have to only choose one. So while we're doing that, let me go back to the panel for a final question for our speakers. In terms of the next steps and reflecting on what we have heard from the audience and the questions that have come in, what do you think should happen now to implement a debt for climate and nature swap initiative? What should be the next steps in this space, basically? So if you could each try to answer that fairly quickly, a minute each, because we're not far away from the end, that would be brilliant. Paul, can I ask you to go first?
Sure. I'm just going to essentially repeat what we've already put in the paper, but anyway, for what it's worth, given the fact that we have the IMF and World Bank annual meetings coming up, we think it's opportune now to set up a technical working group, possibly led by the World Bank, to take forward an initiative working with the creditors and the debtor governments to set in place a kind of overall umbrella initiative, a bit like the HIPC process that was used in the late 80s for debt relief in low-income countries, and that would work over the next 3 years or so. As we've heard, each country is different, so that would provide an umbrella under which individual countries would negotiate with their creditors to take forward this kind of climate for nature program swaps.
Thank you very much, Paul. Sonja, what would be your quick take on what needs to happen now?
So I think Paul's, the technical working group is a fantastic idea and absolutely needed for execution, but what you also need, I think, is a steer from global governance bodies. And here I'd point to the G20 in particular as a body that has the power to get something like this moving. You know, it's a global problem. It's not going to be resolved at the national level. They're cross-border issues. So a body like the G20 needs to address this.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. Shamshad, what would be your thoughts on the immediate next steps?
I think what Paul and Sonja said is together right. I think what we definitely need out here is strong leadership. So when we talk about G20, we should also talk about other international platforms like G24, which has a different mindset on this. So we should definitely look at these global platforms and engage, almost have a summit of the leaders. Now, you know, we have had this FFD, Financing for Development Dialogue, where a lot of experts, Sonja was there, I was listening to it and contributing. So there have been a lot of people involved in this. There should be a summit on financing for development, which has an element of debt swaps out there. So now that an innovative instrument is going to be scaled. We have had this instrument in the past, but we have learned from experience that there are difficult implementation issues that we face. So drawing from those lessons, we should get the political leadership to first agree on this. And I think it's must that we have the World Bank, IMF in partnership, but also technical bodies that understand climate issues, biodiversity, and some of the UN bodies are really great into this, and ultimately it also involves the conventions and the likes of it, because some of this is cross-border. So it's not that simple, but we should keep it simple, but we should involve people who understand cross-border issues also here.
Fantastic. Really great contributions. Many thanks. So, Juliet, can I ask you to put up the results of the second poll? So, yeah, lots of people who think everyone should lead, I think, but that's in this context actually okay. So, yeah, and the general sense is that here that probably the bank would be the best coordinator within this, but it's by no means a clear result, I would say. There's also 51% for environmental NGOs and 49% for OECD governments within that. So huge thanks to everyone, to all the participants. Apologies to anyone whose question I wasn't able to get to. But above all, thanks to our excellent panel of speakers, to Paul, to Shamshad and Sonja. They were really great contributions, and it was nice to see the way that you built on what each other said and moved us forward through this, which was fantastic. Also, huge thanks, Paul, to Sijal, your co-author on the paper, which was great to have. And just a final note, I think as Paul mentioned, the World Bank and IMF annual meetings are happening in October. So we will be looking for ways of feeding this discussion into those meetings. But I'd just finally like to thank everyone, participants and speakers, for joining, very much indeed. We will share a link to the paper as well as the recorded session and the presentation slides with those that register for the event. And all of that will also be available on our website. And if you do have a minute, please do share your feedback by clicking on the link in the chat box, which will take you to a very simple survey. And with that, I would like to close the webinar and say huge thanks to everyone, particularly Shamshad, Sonja and Paul. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. Wish you best.
Thank you.